I wanted to just alert you to the fact that the personal leadership profile that you filled out before we actually started the first session this morning, that, as you probably have guessed, is actually consistent with every one of the elements of the Leadership for Learning framework. So when you get your profile back, you will see that you've got your own ratings of your work in the area of shared leadership, and it will be compared against the ratings of others in like-banded schools. So that instrument that you've completed is that blueprint in classificatory form. Does that make sense? Now, the other thing about the use of the blueprint is that we're going to move now to use an instrument to gather some evidence from you, and I'm really going to ask you, if you will, to spend enough quiet time on it yourself, because you're going to be putting down a footprint of your view of the strength to which you believe each of the dimensions of the blueprint are evident in your school if you were to apply the blueprint to literacy. So in other words, if you look at the middle moral purpose and you come into the document with the blueprint on it, you'll see the little asterisk there that says developing a shared moral purpose, and look down below, it says improved literacycle. Is that what you've got there? Yeah, that's what I've got too. Well, that should be improved literacy, learning and achievement. Now somehow, John, this has been missed by the printer's electronic means. I think his USB became silent at that point. So it's improved literacy, learning and achievement. I've just got to ask John, this is on the USB? Okay, so you will be able to make an adjustment to it before you determine to use it with your staff. All right? So, what we're asking you to do is this. Up on the PowerPoint slide, for those down at the back, it says to reflect on the strength of each of the dimensions of the Leadership for Literacy Learning blueprint in your own school. So in other words, you're going to sit quietly and taking the first box on the left, which is about participating actively in professional development for literacy. Can you see the arrow pointing over that box? Okay, so you think about yourself and you're participating actively in professional development in your school, and the extent to which your teachers also participate actively in professional development in your school. Have you got high quality participatory professional development? Understood? And you give it a rating. You give it a rating for your school. You're trying to lift yourself from your personal rating to, it's pretty good participatory professional development for literacy in my school. I think I'm going to score this about a 7 or 7.5, because a lot of people actually put a halfway mark on some of these things. And similarly, if you go over to the strong evidence base, so you see that one? How strong is your use of a strong evidence base in your school? Do your teachers use good quality evidence, quantitative and qualitative evidence that's available to them, test scores, other assessment devices and so on? How strong would you rate your use of evidence in your school? And you give it a score. So we're asking you to give yourself scores around the blueprint, and then look at what you've done and make a judgment about which area of that blueprint do you think you should pay some attention to in your judgment about your school. And then lastly, think about how you might make use of this instrument with your staff, because this is as much an instrument for the staff of a school as it is for you personally. So why am I getting you to do it here quietly on your own today? I'm getting you to do it so that you have actually done it and you put it away in order for you to then give it to your teachers to make sure that there is a big difference in time between your assessment of the school and when you get your teachers to do it. It's just sufficient distance so that you're not part of what they're doing. Now, this is the production of what Timperley and Robertson call a SMART tool. You probably read it in the literature. A SMART tool is a tool which enables discussion to occur amongst leadership groups within the school, principals and teachers together. Because you will be able to score their results and you'll see your own scores. You could actually score, if you're a fortunate principal to have a deputy principal and perhaps a literacy coordinator, you could score those people that are in positional leadership roles as distinct from the teachers. If you're in a very small school on your own, well, give it to yourself here today and then in a week's time when you get back, do it again and see if you've changed your mind. Sorry, I just made that up. Because I know there's some small school principals here. Who's from a one-teacher school? Nobody. Oh, well, that's good. If there's only one or two other members of staff, you'll still be able to see whether there are some gaps between your perception of the school against these dimensions and other members of staff. So you'll see why I'm asking you to complete it yourself as a base, do it quietly. I'll listen around for when the hubbub starts again, and then I'll set you your next task. Okay? Well, you've got around about 25 minutes to do this, so you can take your time and just move into it as you feel. What I'm going to ask you to do, which you've probably already started and I've rudely interrupted, is for you to take one of the dimensions on your assessment and talk about the evidence around the table, why you've rated it in the way you have. Now, I'm just saying take one of the dimensions. It can be one that you've rated very strongly. What evidence have you got for that? It could be one that you've rated not so strongly. What evidence have you got for that? I would like you to talk that through so each person at the table has a chance to talk about one of the dimensions in their school and why you've rated it that way. So go around your table and that will take you, I am sure, about 20 minutes. If they've gone on for more than about 3 minutes, have an appropriate person with a hook to hook them off. So about 3 minutes or so for an individual to go around the table, and then, having heard all of that, please spend about another 5 to 10 minutes maximum just on how might you use this document with your staff. And this document, you'll have an electronic form. So you don't actually have to use it exactly the same way it's presented to you, do you? You can make adjustments to it. So you can be thinking about that in terms of how you might use it with your staff, elements of your staff, even others who are associated with your school. So round the table, and of course, as quick as you can, I'll give a nod in a roundabout. I'm looking at about 20 odd minutes around the table, so that's going to have some of you going quickly, and then a maximum of about another 10 minutes for the final discussion about how to use it. So that's 30 minutes. By 12:30 we should finish this, and I'll start you on the last activity before lunch at 1, okay? So 30 minutes, go. A lot of talk around the tables. I certainly participated in one, and they were a very disciplined group, I must say, and you'll hear that word quite a deal this afternoon. Group over on my left. My family leans a little to the left in politics. I've got a son in federal politics, so I should disclose that now. But self-disclosure is a very important thing, and I had some of it around the table that I was listening to. Self-disclosure. And, you know, you can only do that if you're feeling reasonably comfortable. That's one of the things that we've tried to build into this process of action learning and action research on the way through the PALL project, so that you should feel reasonably comfortable in talking with other principals whom you know about common language things, because it does help if you're talking about similar things, and certainly with your regional leadership consultants. There are times when self-disclosure is quite cathartic. There are times when, of course, you're very circumspect, but certainly in lines of supervision, sometimes self-disclosure actually loses out, and it's very important to do so. That's actually flavoured, if you like, with the notion that self-reporting by people in leadership positions generally tends to paint a slightly more rosy picture of reality than does the picture painted by classroom teachers and those with their knees closer to the ground. It's just a research effect. So you just need to be aware of that. Even if you've scored yourself low, it's highly likely your teachers have scored you lower. Just be aware of that. Because to some extent, the truth, if there is such a thing in research, and we don't say that in, secular institutions like universities, the truth will lie somewhere between the proximal and distal effects of involvement in doing something. Okay, so keep that in mind. Now, I just wanted to see whether or not we could get 2 or 3 tables to give us a couple of points that were raised about the leadership dimensions, where there was work that was either strong or where there was work that needed some action. So 2 or 3 tables on that, and hopefully there are 2 or 3 tables that can say something about how they might use this instrument back at school. Using this instrument back at school. I'm asking you, in saying so, is this an instrument that describes leadership for learning for principals only? It isn't really, is it? It describes leadership for learning if you're thinking about leadership as a collective activity rather than position. So I'm asking you the question in another way. Should you keep this thing to yourself, or should you be using it in a range of different ways? So let me just let you bubble for 2 minutes to find a person who's going to talk about 1 or 2 of the things that you disclosed about your schools, and it doesn't have to be yours, you can say it was his or hers. Right? And then we'll ask a couple of other tables to tell us something about how they might use it back at school. So a couple of minutes and I'll ding the bell again and you'll have somebody nominated to talk. So everybody's going to find somebody to talk even though you mightn't get picked. Go. Okay, Leonie is going to, she's just going to find a table. It's up to you to find which table. You've just got to look at them in the eyes and make sure that you get one who's not looking down. And
who's been nice to me over the years?
Now we're just looking for some points that have been made around the table about the strength with which particular dimensions have been being seen in the school and the evidence on which that has been discussed.
Got a volunteer?
Okay, we found a volunteer. There's a piece of cake in this for you.
Thank you. I am personally data challenged. I struggle with analysing and using data. I think my teachers are much better than I am, by the way. But I also think that there could be a systems response to the imperative to store it and collect it and analyse it and to use it. And at the moment it's done in a pretty ad hoc sort of way. We in the West are lucky to have a young man who's doing databases and he's happy to share it and to individualise it across the schools. But our data system in schools, EdSAS, doesn't allow us to put the data there. Now, I feel that there's a real willingness amongst principals and teachers to use data and to use it well to inform learning. Mm-hmm. But I think that we're up against it, frankly, without tools that make that pretty easy.
Okay, well, we'll be working on the use of data this afternoon. We'll probably do 4 or 5 different examples, so you hopefully will get something from that, and happy to talk more about it later on with you individually. But certainly we will be doing work on data this afternoon, picking up that issue of discipline dialogue and what principals need to be able to lead as a generic strategy to engage with data. Yep.
I'm looking for volunteers. Oh. Beautiful. You could be either kind, but
yes.
talk about having
Yeah, okay, you can talk about either. I mean,
Okay.
let's be
Our
flexible.
table had a plan, you see, so I don't want to muck up yours. I'm going to talk about how we're going to use it back at our sites, and my table's asked me to talk about how I'm going to, because we're a birth to 12 site, and I saw that this tool would be really useful regardless of, you know, what level you come from. It would actually be a common language that you could be using right across your site, and would actually, you know, help you come up with, you know, your whole school approach and that consistency. So it would be a really good tool, birth to 12.
Yes, thank you for that. I was asking whether or not it would be used at the school, and I've even asked myself a question because I was listening quite carefully to a group over here. Could you use this particular framework and perhaps a modified instrument with members of school advisory councils or governors of schools? Would they gain anything from it? You need to ask yourself the question and how you might use it. Would it be important for them to know the kind of ground that has to be covered in leading learning? Would that help you? Have you found somebody? One more? Yes, one more on that, and then we'll see if we can move to the strategies. Or anything, really.
Oh, hi, we're from all sitting from York Mid North. We've got a variety of schools here, R to 12 through to little two teachers schools. And in terms of the strengths, we had a number of examples about participating actively in professional development, but we got into an interesting discussion. Does that mean you actually have to attend, or is it if someone attends and you do the follow-up conversations afterwards? Yeah, and those levels of discussions. And the area that a number around the table felt they would like to explore more was the connecting with the parents and the wider community. And once again got into a really interesting discussion about what does that actually look like these days, what does that mean when you live in country areas, and really interesting discussions around that.
Yes, there's no doubt that a number of tables would have had some self-disclosure about the strength or otherwise of the connection beyond the school into parents, families and the community. Harder the lower down the SES bands you go, but still difficult the higher up the SES bands you go for other reasons. No, you know, nobody's actually got the easy track here, but in terms of literacy, it's a harder track the lower down the SES bands. You know the data, you know the findings here that are pretty comprehensive, where we haven't gained as much traction as perhaps we ought. Have you found me? There's two more to go. Yes.
Can't keep up with the volunteers.
Oh, you can't keep up with them. Okay, two more to go.
Volunteered, I think is the word you're looking for. We talked about all sorts of things, but I guess one thing we've talked about is how this would actually be a very useful tool to apply on a range of different levels back at the site. I mean, even from a classroom teacher's perspective, it might be quite informative to us as leaders to see what areas they might identify as being deficit or strong. Ranging through to using it as a whole staff to look at what sorts of, which particular domains we could focus on or build more capacity with.
Thank you. And one more, Leonie, of the volunteered version.
Okay, Far North Group, it was a varied input, and it ranged from, yes, this would be a very useful tool to use back in the site, to no, it wouldn't. And the reasons behind that were very situational, and it depended very much on the school culture and whether staff had been beaten up by data in the past. And so I think where we ended up on consensus was you'd either use it explicitly with a whole school or individual staff members, or you'd have a very good picture in your head as the school leader and start those discussions around that model without actually pushing the model under their nose. So we had the situational cultural background of how's data been used in the past and are people data shy?
Lovely. Okay, well, thank you very much for that, Leonie, and all that assistance. I just want to point you to a couple of further things. This is obviously electronically available. You can change the way in which you want to use it. I have seen it used in the low SES environments where we were working in the PALL pilot project, and these are decile 9 and 10 schools, you know, really the lowest of our SES indices, and they actually added in to the diagram, the blue diagram, they added in here, coming away from the middle, another box out here, which was what's the strength with which we see the school's moral purpose being exercised. How strongly would we rate the commitment of we all to the school's moral purpose here? And that is improving the lives of learners through learning, and of course in this particular case improving the literacy learning of children and their achievement. Because we know schools make a difference. Now I've got something for you to see this afternoon from a school which acts as an instrument to bring into the centre of people's thinking the moral purpose of the school, particularly for very, very difficult or complex environments. Now you can still do exactly the same in the so-called leafy suburb environments because the moral purpose doesn't change. We all are about improving the lives of children through learning. So it's possible for you to add elements in that reflect every aspect of those dimensions. The principle down at the back there, over here, I think, mentioning data, you can go into the issue of disciplined dialogue or professional conversations using data and see the extent to which the staff believes that you have very strong commitment to those kinds of professional conversations. You may think it's happening, they may think it's happening. Wonderful if you think it's happening together. So this kind of tool, if you just, it's data which is indicative. I want to really push home this point with you that inside schools we need more data that opens up the conversation than we need definitive data that is standardised. Right? We'll get the standardised data from the standardised testing processes that occur that check children's achievement. And we do have standardised testing processes in literacy that help us diagnostically, don't we? But you do need data about learning. And the data that you get about learning has to act as a tin opener for the professional conversations that you would have around the table with members of staff. Does it have to be so robust that it will stand up to an effects analysis by a meta-analytical guru such as Hattie or such as Timperley or such as Robinson? The answer is no. The answer is that the data has to be sufficiently informing from the people who are practicing in order to be able to stimulate or generate the conversation. And data that qualifies as being smart, provided by smart tools, at least allows you to see that there are potential differences between people. Because if shared leadership is anything, it's about lining people up together to work on common issues where they see a planned and systematic way forward to which they've contributed. Your data at school level, appropriately composed, appropriately contributed to by members of staff, by children, by parents, is really the kinds of data that we need for those professional conversations. So I'm going to say a little bit more about that after we've had our lunch. I just wanted to mention a couple of other things and then give perhaps a little bit of a right of reply to you before we do break for lunch. We found in a number of schools, quite a number of schools, that it's a very good thing for a principal to do, having looked at this blueprint, and there are others around. I mean, there are capabilities frameworks, there are standards frameworks. This is just a framework drawn particularly from the research. You could use this one, you could use something else, but we found it particularly valuable for principals to be able to say to start, what I'm trying to do in the school is to lead across a range of important dimensions for learning in which we all play a part. So it's very important that we have a conversation about that framework for leadership that I'm certainly trying to inform myself about, that I'm modifying on the way and that we will modify together. So putting it out there, not as a private matter, but as a public matter in the professional discourse, has had a capacity in the pilot project in many schools of informing the discussion and making or helping teachers feel included in leadership. This is the way we're trying to lead things in this school. I feel included in leadership. It's not that the boss has got it over here and she ducks off over there and, oh, you've got that. It's that we know what's happening. So the more you're able to adjust a framework that you're employing for leadership, the better. And the more, if I can jump at least to another level of synthesis, the more that you can employ a blended approach to leadership, because that's what this framework is. It's a blended approach to leadership. The research shows very clearly that it generates more power. Single bits all help, but the blended approach really has quite significant power. So you can get your teachers to fill it out. You can get the teachers to actually add up all the scores and take the means for each of those dimensions. You can compare it with your own. And this brings me to the final point that I want to make before we break. How you make use of the data that is generated around these leadership dimensions really requires aspects of leadership that I haven't spoken about this morning. If you go to Vivian Robertson's work, her work builds on the National College of School Leadership, which showed you that there were particular attributes that leaders needed to display. Remember, optimism was the last one I spoke about? Problem solving, capacity, ability to relate. So there are certain capacities that leaders need to display. Robinson in her work calls them certain knowledge and dispositions. So she talks about dimensions like these over which you must work if you're connecting your work through the research literature to learning. And she talks about dispositions. And the dispositions she talks about are these. And you'll recognise them. These are not unusual. They actually have a knowledge and relational component to them, because you'll never get people to engage with data and handle difficult conversations unless the relationship base is there, will you? Leadership at its most human is relational, even though I told you the fundamental concepts were purpose, context and agency. You don't get agency without the relational component of it. So she talks about her dispositions. The dispositions from their research that leaders need to be able to display are these. Trying to ensure that administrative decisions are informed by knowledge and research about effective pedagogy. After all, we are professionals informed by a professional disciplinary base. So we should be entering into the research, translating it and employing it. Second, a disposition for school leaders is the capacity to analyse and solve complex problems. You've heard that before from the NCSL. Teachers need to be able to see that you have a collective capacity to do that, and as an individual principal, you know that is part and parcel of your role to aid in the solving of complex problems. This is all built on what you know Andy Hargraves wrote about many years ago. It's all built on relational trust. So you can't engage with difficult questions that might be quite contestable without having the relational trust in there. One of the things that we found out in the pilot project on PALL is that it is quite possible for you, through tabling data and having conversations across the table about those data, to use those conversations as part and parcel of building relational trust in a no-blame environment. It's your fault. You know, these are what the data are showing. Let's examine what the data are saying. It can actually be a focus for building a relational trust. And lastly, Robinson calls this the disposition. It's a funny one. It's a long term. Being open to learning conversations. And the open to learning is hyphenated. Open to learning. So being open to learning conversations. So as a leader, in order to be able to cement home relational trust, members of staff have to know that you're open to learning. You don't have the answers, all of them, all the time. You've got some of them some of the time, that's for sure, and they'll want you to have some of them some of the time. But they won't expect you to have them all of the time. So a leader who demonstrates through discussions about what is there inside the school's learning and performance measures, being open to learning about what needs to be done. So I thought I should finish with that, because I've only concentrated here in the summary of research on those dimensions over which a leader needs to really factor in his or her work during the course of a term, a semester, a year. You don't have to do every one of these things every day, but they've got to be done during the course of the context of a significant period of time. But then, on the other side of the equation, you need to bring into play those clear interpersonal dispositions or attributes that you know act as the oil or the grease for the strong human relationships that are necessary to do any of this kind of work. It also goes beyond that out into families and communities, as you know. And they also say that it goes upwards in terms of your regional officers and other people, so that we're relationally managing up as well as managing across our schools. So I just wanted to leave you with that point, because this particular framework assumes that principals will employ relational and knowledge-based dispositions to actually implement actions of the kind that connect their work with learning and achievement. We're going to stop now for lunch, and when we come back after lunch, we'll be moving into the middle of this equation here, or not equation, the middle of this diagram. I'm going to be looking at the two bases. I'm going to be looking at the two bases here, a strong evidence base and disciplined dialogue, and how those two are linked in the centre of this particular model to the school's moral purpose. So I'll be dealing with these three major matters here, but travelling around the diagram with some qualitative and quantitative data. So it's lunchtime, folks.